The radio crackled with a morning jingle as the Daniels' living room woke up. Dust sat on the window louvers, and a frayed sofa sagged under years of use. Caleb's worn Bible rested open on his knees while the host's voice from the radio promised hope between static. He cleared his throat and closed the book. Amen. God remains faithful, the younger children echoed softly. Mercy stayed silent, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the cracked wall clock above the doorway. Grace poured pap into chipped cups, the spoon tapping the pot. Mercy stood abruptly, papers clenched. My admission is gone, she said, slapping the letter on the table. 80,000. That's all. Chairs scraped. Caleb rose, palms open, asking for calm. Mercy's voice sharpened. Prayer didn't stop the deadline. She pushed past them, sandals snapping against the concrete floor as the door rattled behind her. The radio kept talking to no one. Silence followed, broken only by the radio's hiss. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out an old brass watch. Its glass scratched. His thumb rubbed the frozen hands. It's not that time has stopped, he murmured to the empty room. We're waiting on God's time. He slipped it back into his pocket. Grace wiped her hands on her wrapper and stared at the door Mercy had slammed. Outside, Mercy walked fast, dodging puddles and shouting vendors. Her phone buzzed with messages from classmates sharing campus photos. She stopped under a mango tree beside the road. Knees bent, palms pressed together, lips tight. If you're there, you see this, she said quietly. A bus roared past, spraying muddy water onto her skirt. She looked up, said nothing more, and stood back into the street noise. Later, Mercy returned home, shoes dusty. Grace tried to speak, but Mercy moved straight to her small room. The bed creaked as she sat. A Bible lay on the table beside old notebooks. She pushed it aside and lay back, staring at the ceiling fan clicking unevenly. From the living room, Caleb's voice drifted in prayer, steady and low. Mercy turned her face to the wall and covered her ears with a pillow. Evening brought kerosene smoke and the smell of frying onions. The family gathered again, quieter now. The radio host, Michael Grant, spoke about endurance. Mercy laughed once, short and dry. Easy words from a studio, she said. Caleb didn't respond. He folded his Bible carefully, aligning the edges, then placed it on the shelf. The wall clock ticked unevenly, 1 second stretching longer than the next. Night settled fully. Mercy stepped outside with a small notebook, sat on the concrete step, and wrote numbers again and again. 80,000. Circled, underlined. From inside, dishes clinked. A neighbor's generator coughed to life. Mercy tore the page out, crumpled it, and dropped it beside her foot. She stared at the streetlight flickering across the road. Caleb came out quietly and sat beside her, leaving space between them. He held the pocket watch again, not opening it. Morning will come, he said. Mercy stood immediately. Morning doesn't pay fees. She walked past him into the dark. Caleb stayed seated, shoulders still, listening to her footsteps fade. The watch remained closed in his palm. Inside, Grace knelt by the sofa, hands gripping the cushion seam until threads loosened. Words came out broken, then steadier. The radio had gone silent. Only the ceiling fan clicked overhead. She pressed her forehead to the cushion and stayed there as the house settled, doors creaking, children breathing softly in sleep. In her room, Mercy lay awake as a motorcycle sped past outside, engine whining. She reached for her phone, scrolling job ads, market posts, anything promising cash. The ceiling fan stuttered again. From the living room, Caleb's low voice resumed prayer. Mercy locked her screen and stared upward, jaw tight, as the fan dragged the night forward. Morning returned with the clang of metal bowls and the smell of charcoal smoke from nearby stalls. Mercy balanced a tray of baked buns on her head as she stepped into the crowded market street. Traders shouted prices. A generator rattled somewhere behind a shop. She adjusted the tray, sweat already gathering at her temples, and took her usual corner near the bus stop where commuters hurried past without looking twice. She had sold only 3 buns when 2 men blocked her path. One tugged at the tray, while the other chewed on a toothpick. "Market fee," the taller one said. "Palm out." Mercy shook her head quickly. "I paid last week." The shorter man laughed and named 4,000. A bus screeched nearby, brakes screaming. Mercy clutched the tray tighter, eyes darting as traders pretended not to see. A calm voice cut through the noise. "Leave her." A man in a neat shirt stepped between them, polished shoes dusty from the street. He dropped money into the thug's hand without counting. The men melted away. The stranger turned to Mercy and bought everything on her tray, counting out 30,000. "Find a safer way," he said, already walking off into the crowd. Mercy stood frozen, the empty tray light on her head. Traders stared now, whispering. She counted the notes twice, fingers shaking. The bus stop roared again, as engines revved. She stepped aside, leaned against a pole, and exhaled sharply through her teeth. The stranger was gone. The money stayed heavy in her hand. At home, Grace lifted her hands in praise when Mercy poured the money onto the table. "God has done it," she said, voice rising. The younger children clapped. Caleb listened quietly, eyes narrowed, then nodded once. Mercy crossed her arms. "So God sent the men first?" she asked. The room fell silent. Grace's hands lowered slowly. That evening, Sister Agnes arrived with her worn handbag and gentle smile. She spoke softly about service and trust while sipping tea. Mercy sat stiffly, staring at the cup rim. When asked to lead the next house fellowship, Mercy pushed the cup away. "Find someone else." Chairs creaked as bodies shifted. Caleb said nothing, his fingers tapping lightly against his pocket. The discussion rose quickly. Grace's voice tightened, pleading. Sister Agnes quoted scripture. Mercy stood, voice sharp. "If this is faith, it's empty." The elder gasped softly. Mercy's words came louder. "Curse God and die." She grabbed her bag and walked out as Grace called after her. The door shut hard enough to shake the window louvers. The next day, Mercy stood at a motor park, whistle hanging from her neck. Buses honked non-stop. She shouted destinations until her throat burned. A driver shoved coins into her hand, shorting her pay. When she protested, he cursed loudly, drawing laughter from passengers. Exhaust smoke hung thick as she swallowed her words and waved the bus off. That night, the same driver followed her home. He banged the gate, shouting accusations. Neighbors peeked from doorways. He demanded money she didn't owe. Caleb stepped out. Calm, but firm. The man laughed and spat on the ground before leaving. Mercy stood behind her father, face rigid, fists clenched at her sides. Later, as dishes were washed in silence, Mercy spoke without looking up. "I got another job." Grace turned slowly. "Office work. Summit Logistics Group," Mercy added, forcing a smile. Caleb paused, water dripping from his hands. He studied her for a long moment, then returned to the sink. Outside, a dog barked as night settled over the house again. Sunday arrived with church bells echoing down the street. Inside the Daniels' living room, plastic chairs were arranged for house fellowship. Grace adjusted the curtains while Sister Agnes checked her notebook. Mercy remained in her room. When Grace knocked, Mercy opened the door halfway. "I'm not leading anything," she said flatly. The murmur of arriving neighbors drifted in as Grace stepped back, lips pressed tight. The fellowship began without Mercy. Songs rose, uneven but sincere. From her room, Mercy listened to the clapping and singing bleed through the thin walls. She turned up her phone volume, drowning it with a recorded sermon advert for a job fair. Outside, a child laughed. Inside, the voices kept singing, steady and persistent. When the meeting ended, Sister Agnes stood near Mercy's door. "You were raised better," she said gently. Mercy stepped out, eyes level. "I was raised hopeful." Grace stepped between them, voice shaking as she begged Mercy to reconsider. Mercy's reply cut through the hallway. "Hope doesn't pay rent." She grabbed her bag and left again. That afternoon, Mercy rode a bus across town. The conductor shouted stops while music blared from cracked speakers. She watched office buildings replace kiosks and roadside sellers. The bus slowed in front of a glass-fronted building with a clean sign. Summit Logistics Group. Mercy stepped down, straightened her dress, and walked toward the doors. Inside, the air was cool and quiet. Leather chairs lined a waiting area lit by recessed lights. A man with a thin smile introduced himself as Viper. Papers slid across the table. "Discretion is required," he said, tapping the folder. Mercy nodded quickly, eyes scanning the polished floor instead of his face. She was led into a back room where a small blade glinted under white light. Another man pricked her finger. A drop of blood stained a document. Words were spoken she barely followed. "You speak of this to no one," Viper said. Mercy's jaw tightened as she nodded again. The paper was folded and taken away. That evening, Mercy returned home carrying a handbag bulging at the seams. She poured bundles of cash onto the table. 800,000 spread across the wood. Grace covered her mouth. The children stared wide-eyed. Mercy lifted her chin. "I told you I'd fix it." Caleb didn't move closer. His eyes stayed on Mercy, not the money. Caleb finally spoke. "No blessing born of an oath against God can prosper." He pushed the money back toward her. Mercy scoffed loudly. "You prefer empty prayers?" She swept the cash back into her bag. Grace watched, trembling, as Mercy walked past her room without stopping. Late that night, Grace entered Mercy's room quietly. Mercy slept, exhausted. Grace opened the bag and counted out 150,000 with shaking hands. She whispered apologies as she hid it in her wrapper. In the hallway, the wall clock ticked unevenly. Grace paused, pressed her forehead to the door, then turned away. In the living room, Caleb sat alone. He removed the pocket watch and opened it fully, staring at the unmoving hands. He closed it again and slipped it into his pocket. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance as the house settled into uneasy silence. The truth arrived without ceremony. Grace stood in the kitchen as the radio reported a police raid on a logistics front linked to narcotics. The name matched the card Mercy had dropped days earlier. Grace's hand froze mid-stir. The spoon clanged against the pot. She turned the radio louder, listening as addresses and arrests were listed. Her knees buckled, and she grabbed the counter to stay upright. Grace rushed to Mercy's room and pulled the bag from under the bed. She emptied it onto the mattress. Cash spilled out with documents bearing stamps and coded numbers. Grace pressed a hand over her mouth. She slid down to the floor, wrapper loosening, and rocked slightly as distant traffic hummed through the open window. She crawled to the living room and knelt beside the sofa. Words came out uneven, then steadier. She confessed aloud, naming the money she had taken and the fear that drove her. Her palms struck the floor once, then again. The wall clock ticked unevenly above her. She stayed there until her voice went hoarse. Police sirens cut through the afternoon heat. Mercy stepped out of a building with hands raised as officers shouted instructions. Her phone dropped and skidded across the pavement. A crowd gathered, recording. An officer snapped cuffs around her wrists. Mercy's jaw set as she was guided into the back of a van, doors slamming shut. At home, Caleb answered the knock. 2 officers spoke briefly. Grace collapsed onto a chair as Mercy's name was read aloud. Caleb nodded once. Steady. Then closed the door gently. He removed the pocket watch, holding it tight in his fist, knuckles whitening, before returning it to his pocket. Blackwood Penitentiary loomed under a dull sky. Mercy stepped down from the van into a line of detainees. Boots scraped concrete. Orders barked. Her belongings were dumped into a tray. A guard shaved her hairline unevenly and handed her a faded uniform. The metal gate groaned open and shut behind her. Inside, Mercy sat on a narrow bench as fingerprints were taken. A detective slid a folder across the table. Names, he said. Mercy stared at the tabletop. I won't talk, she replied. The detective exhaled sharply and closed the folder. A guard signaled for her to stand. Her cell smelled of disinfectant and rust. 2 women glanced up as Mercy entered. One laughed quietly. Mercy claimed the top bunk, gripping the metal rail as voices echoed down the corridor. Somewhere, a door slammed hard. She lay flat, eyes open, staring at peeling paint inches from her face. That night, Grace gathered the family in the living room. Candles flickered as power failed. Caleb read scripture aloud, voice steady. The children huddled close. Grace knelt again, hands open, speaking Mercy's name repeatedly. Outside, rain struck the zinc roof in sharp bursts. In Blackwood, Mercy lay awake as footsteps passed the cell. A distant radio played a muffled song. She pressed her lips together, recalling the oath's words, and stayed silent. The corridor lights dimmed. The metal door clicked, sealing the night around her. Morning light crept across the Daniels' living room as Caleb's phone rang. He answered quietly. The voice on the line spoke in clipped, professional tones, offering a senior consultancy role with a $20 million retainer. Caleb sat down slowly. Grace watched his face change as details were repeated. He thanked the caller, ended the call, and remained still as the ceiling fan clicked overhead. Grace broke the silence first. Who was it? Caleb opened his pocket and removed the old watch. He wound the crown gently. A faint click followed, then another. The second hand lurched forward and began to move. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. His time, he said, barely above a whisper. Grace covered her mouth, staring at the ticking watch. News traveled fast. Relatives called. Neighbors stopped by. The house filled with murmurs and cautious smiles. Caleb remained composed, setting papers neatly on the table. Grace stepped aside to call her brother about Joshua's fees. The watch ticked steadily in Caleb's pocket as voices rose and fell around him. At Blackwood, Mercy scrubbed trays in the kitchen line. Steam rose from pots. A fellow inmate leaned close and spoke under her breath. Your people are asking questions. Mercy shook her head once and kept scrubbing. The clang of metal drowned out everything else as guards watched from the doorway. Across town, Viper sat in a darkened office, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was calm. She's a risk now. He named a price. The man on the other end agreed. Viper ended the call and stared at the city lights through tinted glass, fingers drumming once on the desk. Officer Briggs counted money inside his car. Dashboard lights glowing. 3 million naira lay stacked on the seat. He tucked it into a backpack and started the engine. The prison walls appeared ahead as he drove, their concrete surface catching the late afternoon sun. In the infirmary kitchen, Briggs poured clear liquid into a small vial. He checked the label once, then pocketed it. A nurse walked past, nodding casually. Briggs nodded back and continued down the corridor, footsteps measured, face unreadable. Mercy queued for dinner, metal tray in hand. The line moved slowly. A kitchen worker spooned food onto her plate, pausing just long enough for Briggs to tip the vial into the stew. Mercy didn't notice. She took the tray and walked away as the guard stepped back into the shadows. Back home, Caleb gathered the family again. He placed the ticking watch on the table this time. "We thank God," he said, voice steady. Grace nodded, eyes wet, hands clasped. Outside, thunder rolled faintly as rain clouds gathered again over the neighborhood. In her cell, Mercy pushed the food around her tray. She ate slowly, then stopped. A guard shouted lights out. Mercy lay back on the bunk as the corridor dimmed. Her breathing changed, shallow and uneven, as the metal door clanged shut and the night pressed in. Mercy convulsed on the bunk as the corridor lights flickered. Her tray clattered to the floor. Another inmate shouted for help. Boots thundered closer. A guard unlocked the cell and dragged Mercy onto a stretcher. Her skin had gone pale, lips tinged blue. The stretcher wheels rattled as they sprinted toward the infirmary, alarms beginning to chirp in uneven bursts. The infirmary doors burst open. Monitors were wheeled in, wires snapped onto Mercy's chest. The screen spiked, then dipped erratically. A nurse checked pupils and barked for oxygen. The alarm sharpened into a continuous tone as the line flattened. A long, straight sound filled the room. One nurse stepped back. "We've lost her." Nurse Deborah stood frozen for a beat, eyes on the screen. Another nurse grabbed her arm. "We need the doctor. Don't touch her." Deborah pulled free and placed both palms on Mercy's chest. "Give me 1 minute," she said. The other nurse shook her head. "This isn't allowed." Deborah didn't move. Deborah spoke clearly, not raising her voice. "The Lord will command the blessing upon you in your storehouses and in all that you set your hand to," she said, quoting Deuteronomy 28:8. The other nurse protested again, reaching for Deborah's wrist. Deborah kept her hands firm, eyes fixed on Mercy's still face. The alarm droned. Deborah continued. "Jesus said, 'No one can snatch them out of my Father's hand,'" she quoted from John 10:29. The other nurse stepped back, jaw clenched, whispering, "If this goes wrong," Deborah cut in softly. "It won't." Deborah leaned closer. "I command the spirit of death to loose its hold. I speak life by the covenant that cannot be broken. You will not die, but live." Sweat beaded at her temples. The room held its breath. The flat line dragged on. Then a single weak beep pierced the sound. Another beep followed, stronger this time. The line began to rise and fall. The other nurse gasped and rushed to stabilize the drip. "Get the doctor," she shouted. Deborah stepped back, hands trembling now, as the monitor settled into a steady rhythm. Mercy's chest lifted on its own. Hours later, Mercy's eyes fluttered open. Deborah was seated beside her. Mercy's voice came out thin. "Why am I alive?" Deborah answered plainly. "Because God loves you. And prayers were holding you when you couldn't stand." Mercy stared at the ceiling as Deborah spoke about the cross, forgiveness, and a new start. Tears slid from the corners of Mercy's eyes onto the pillow. She nodded slowly. "I want that life," she said. Deborah clasped her hand. "Then receive it." Mercy repeated the words Deborah led, voice cracking but steady enough to finish. The poisoning triggered an investigation. Cameras were reviewed, money trails surfaced, Officer Briggs was arrested. Viper's name reached higher offices. Files moved fast. Mercy, now cooperative, signed statements. Guards watched differently. The air in Blackwood shifted from threat to scrutiny. Weeks later, Mercy stood in the warden's office, thin but upright. Papers were signed. "You're a victim and a witness," the warden said. The cuffs came off. The door opened. Sunlight spilled across the floor as Mercy stepped out, blinking. At home, a small Thanksgiving service filled the living room. Nurse Deborah sat among neighbors. When invited to speak, she stood. Mercy was saved because she was anchored to the faithful prayers of her family, she said. Mercy bowed her head as murmurs of agreement rose. As prayers closed, Caleb placed the pocket watch on the table. It ticked steadily. "We waited on God's time," he said. Mercy reached out and touched it. The ticking continued. Even and sure. As voices joined in thanksgiving and the future restarted on schedule.